A few videos ago, I did a reading from two Anthony Bourdain books, Kitchen Confidential, Adventures in the Culinary Underbelly, and Medium Raw, A Bloody Valentine to the World of Food and the People Who Cook. The reason I made that video separate from this one is there was kind of an extended passage from each book that talked about the weird lives of the ultra-rich that I was somewhat fascinated by and wanted to include in my discussion of these books, but I didn't want to make this video too long by including that entire reading. So I did that one separately, and now I'm going to talk about these two books in more detail. Also, I have a little bit of a surprise for you in this video too, so stay tuned for that. So here's what I knew about Anthony Bourdain prior to his death from depression. Almost nothing, in fact. I knew that he had been on some travel shows, he hosted some cooking stuff, but I really didn't know anything about the guy. It wasn't until his death that I became a little morbidly curious about who he was and what had been going on with him. So when I started to look into him, I found some clips of him doing his travel cooking shows, and from what I saw of him on camera, it seemed that he was really good on camera, that he connected very well with the people that he was interacting with. And what I really loved about him was that he seemed driven to show many diverse cultures and to promote what I would call, for lack of a better term, a global unity in the fact that at the root of it all, we're all just humans who love to connect with each other around a table full of food. So the initial impressions I had from just checking out some clips here and there was that he seemed like a really interesting person. But why did I sit down and read two entire books that he wrote if I wasn't really that big a fan of the guy, or truthfully of cooking shows in general? Well, what I ended up learning was that his story was a true rags to riches story. I believe he was in his 40s when he wrote Kitchen Confidential, and up to that point he had spent his entire career slaving away in kitchens and barely getting by. And then when this book was published, it very quickly shot up the bestsellers list, and literally almost overnight, Anthony Bourdain went from being very poor to extremely rich. And I got to thinking, he wrote an autobiography centered around this profession of being a chef that very few people knew about from an insider's perspective, and it created enormous success for him. Meanwhile, I personally have dreams of writing an autobiography centered around my profession of paramedicine, which again is a world that very few people know much about. So I just thought it would behoove me to at least read one of the most successful examples of this category of book that I'm aware of. And maybe I'd end up walking away from it with some good tips for how to write my own book. And then my brother-in-law ended up loaning Medium Raw to me, so I just read it as well after reading Kitchen Confidential. So let's dive into these books, and I'll pull out some things that I found interesting from both of them. Let's start by having a look at Anthony Bourdain as a person and try to figure out what type of guy he was. Burning with a desire for vengeance and vindication, I applied myself to gaining entry to the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York. My Vassar friends, those who remained on speaking terms with me after 2 years of truly disgusting behavior on my part, thought I was out of my mind, but then they thought that anyway. I'm sure that there was a collective sigh of relief on Vassar's rolling green, well-tended campus that I would no longer be around to cage free drinks, steal drugs, make pointedly cruel remarks, and generally lower the level of discourse. My idols of the time had been, all too predictably, Hunter Thompson, William Burroughs, Iggy Pop, and Bruce Lee. I had had, for some time, a romantic, if inaccurate, view of myself as some kind of hyper-violent junkie Byron. So right off the bat, we get an image into the sort of angry, violent, antisocial youth that Anthony Bourdain was when he was in college. And we also have mention of the drugs that were a part of his life. Now, he was a very odd character in terms of substance addiction. He was somebody who was very much hooked on hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, and the like. Yet he would eventually go on to cure his addiction by becoming a lifelong devoted alcoholic, which I don't know if you can exactly call that an addiction cure, but I suppose for him that substance might have been a better choice than other ones he was using. On that topic, he discusses here one of his restaurant jobs. We were high all the time, sneaking off to the walk-in at every opportunity to conceptualize. Hardly a decision was made without drugs. Pot, quaaludes, cocaine, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms soaked in honey and used to sweeten tea, seconal, tuinol, speed, codeine, and, increasingly, heroin. And here's how Anthony describes himself to an interviewer at the back of Medium Raw. The interviewer asks, "What would be on the playlist in your restaurant? You get your dream spot in Tuscany. What's playing there?" Anthony's answer, "I would never open a restaurant. You mean what's on my iPod? I would never inflict my music on other people in that sense. I'm not that... I am that megalomaniacal, but I'm not going to create a space and inflict it on people. Let them find it, you know. But I guess I am in the business of bludgeoning people. To my credit, I'm not afraid of looking like an asshole on my show. I frequently do. Or in my books." And you certainly get this impression from his books of Anthony being the type to impose his personality and his will on other people. That bludgeoning of his underlings through the sheer force of his own personality. Let's not paint too dark a picture of the guy. Here's one thing I liked that he had to say. "I should add that there is no lower person than a customer who takes out their personal misery or dissatisfaction with their food on their waiter. There should be a special circle of hell for customers who are rude or abusive for no reason at all." And throughout the course of his books, he does put some effort into lifting up the wait staff and the lowly kitchen workers who are sort of at the bottom end of that totem pole and who work so hard and are abused so much by both customers and employers. I feel very strongly that Anthony felt himself to be an underdog in life, and as a result was a true champion of the underdog in everything he participated in. Overall, though, after reading 2 of his books, I came away with a generally negative impression about who he was as a person. But there was an odd mix of sort of this bullying type of person, and yet a supporter of those who were bullied, so it was kind of this odd juxtaposition. He certainly gives a favorable on-camera impression, and it seems that in the early days of his career, he really went out of his way to hang out with the crew members of the travel shows he was doing and sort of be amongst the lay people and fraternize with them and treat them with respect. But then as career and fame and fatigue wore on, he isolated himself more and more from that setting. And this bit here seems to offer a bit of a glimpse into why that might happen and might be a good summary for who he was. "So I've spent half my life watching people, guiding them, trying to anticipate their moods, motivations, and actions, running from them, manipulating and being manipulated by them. They remain a mystery to me. People confuse me. Food doesn't." In that sense, I end up feeling a real kinship with him in terms of being somebody who has been dealt a rough hand in life in a number of ways and who has perhaps been abused by a lot of people and as a result doesn't necessarily understand other people and their motivations. And yet at the same time, he was able to overcome that and be a strong leader and help those around him to be better and to perform better. But let's move beyond him as a person and talk about some of the other people that he worked alongside. In particular, he was in a unique environment where he was exposed to a lot of different cultures, both in terms of his traveling and in terms of the many different people that he worked with in many different restaurants. This exposure to other cultures went a long way back in his life. When he was between the 4th and 5th grades, his family took a family vacation to Europe, and while staying in France, he observed French children. My little French friends were, I was astonished to find, allowed to have a cigarette on Sunday, were given watered vin ordinaire, or ordinary wine, at the dinner table, and best of all, they owned Vélo Solex motorbikes. This was the way to raise kids, I recall thinking, unhappy that my mother did not agree. One quick glimpse into French culture at the time. But the culture he talks the most about is the Spanish culture, due to the amount of South Americans in particular who work in kitchens in restaurants. Anthony advises that if you want to be a chef, learn Spanish. I can't stress this enough. Much of the workforce in the industry you are about to enter is Spanish speaking. The very backbone of the industry, whether you like it or not, is inexpensive Mexican, Dominican, Salvadorian, and Ecuadorian labor, most of whom could cook you under the table without breaking a sweat. And then there's this later in the book. The true backbone of the American restaurant industry, however, remains largely Latino. As long as American kids are absent from the dishwasher station, there will be Mexicans and Ecuadorians entering the business in great numbers, soon, inevitably, to be seen by chefs as the better bet for prep work, then garde-manger, and then line positions. Unlike their more upwardly mobile peers, they are seen as less likely to move on, as being more stable and reliable, thereby promising chefs the kind of stability and continuity we all cherish. They're the ones the incoming white boys look to learn the ropes, and they're the ones who remain behind when the white boys move on to the next thing. Something to keep in mind when you see the almost inevitably white celebrity chef on television or at a public appearance or at an awards ceremony is that back at their restaurant, it's often Latino kitchen workers who are making it possible for them to even be there. Though the level of interest in chefs and in cooking has intensified, the focus remains almost exclusively on the chef, a cult of personality propagated and perpetuated by the willing suspension of disbelief by food writers looking for a punchy hook for their articles, and by chefs and their publicists, no fools we, who are charged with getting more customers through the door to spend money. As before, the people actually cooking your food remain invisible, unacknowledged, anonymous, misunderstood, while customers now want to meet the chef who they saw on TV, have them swing by the table for a little FaceTime. Do they really want to meet the kid from Puebla, Mexico, who actually prepared their tuna? Apparently not. What's really quite sad about this is that most of the staff who work in these kitchens can't even afford to eat at the restaurants that they're cooking the food for. In fact, there's a whole chapter in which Anthony takes one of these staff members and treats him to a dinner in the restaurant he's been working at for years and years and has never eaten at before. So here's this from Medium Raw. In 6 years at Le Bernardin and in 20 years cooking in New York restaurants, Justo Thomas has, like the overwhelming majority of people who cook our food, never eaten in his own restaurant. It's a central irony of fine dining that, unlike the waiters who serve their food, the cooks are very rarely able to afford to eat what they have spent years learning to make. They are usually not welcome in any case. They don't have the clothes for it. Many, if not most, expensive restaurants specifically prohibit their employees from coming as customers at any time. The reasoning is part practical and part, one suspects, aesthetic. Before I leave the Spanish and Latin American folks, I have one more little interesting tidbit to read about them. Many of these Spanish-speaking members of the crew took part in an unusual banking scheme where each week all the members of a large group would sign over all their paychecks to one guy. The recipient was selected on a rotating basis, and the way it worked, I gathered, was that for about 2 months or so, everybody squeaked by doing their best to make do without a check, spending little, until the day it was their turn, at which point they came into thousands of dollars and could spend like drunken sailors. Just kind of a really fascinating practice where they would just go for weeks with nothing and then just have a huge windfall every so often. From that slightly humorous anecdote, we're going to bring down the mood again for the last little cultural note. And with this one, we'll go to the Tokyo fish market, which I found a little bit sickening to read about, but interesting all the same. Tsukiji, Tokyo's central fish market, puts New York's Fulton Street to shame. It's bigger, better, and, unlike its counterpart in Manhattan, a destination worth visiting if only to gape. I arrived by taxi at 4:30 in the morning. The colors of the market alone seemed to burn my retinas. The variety, the strangeness, the sheer volume of seafood available at Tsukiji amounted to a colossal terror dome of mind-boggling dimensions. The simple awareness that the seafood-crazy Japanese were raking, dredging, netting, and hooking that much stuff out of the sea every day gave me pause. And I will tell you that my life as a chef will never be the same again after spending the morning and subsequent mornings there. Scallops in snowshoe-sized black shells lay atop crushed ice. Fish, still flopping, twitching, and struggling in pans of water, spat at me as I walked down the first of many narrow corridors between the vendors' stands. The scene was riotous. Eels, pinned to boards by a spike through the head, were filleted alive. Workers cut loins of tuna off the bone in 2-man teams, lopping off perfect hunks with truly terrifying-looking swords and saws that, mishandled, could easily have halved their partners. Periwinkles, cockles, encyclopedic selections of roes, salted, pickled, cured, and fresh, were everywhere. Fish still bent from rigor mortis, porgy, sardines, swordfish, abalone, spiny lobsters, giant lobsters, blowfish, bonito, bluefin, yellowfin. Tuna was sold like gems, displayed in light boxes and illuminated from below, little labels indicating grade and price. Tuna was king. There was fresh, dried, cut, number 1, number 2, vendors who specialized in the less lovely bits. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of gigantic bluefin and bonito blast frozen on faraway factory ships. Frost-covered 200 to 300 pounders were stacked everywhere like stone figures on Easter Island, a single slice taken from near the tail so that quality could be examined. They were laid out in rows, built up into heaps, sawed into redwood-like sections, still frozen, hauled about on forklifts. There were sea urchins, egg sacs, fish from all over the world. Giant squid as long as an arm and baby squid the size of a thumbnail shared space with whitebait, smelts, what looked like worms, slugs, snails, crabs, mussels, shrimp, and everything else that grew, swam, skittered, clawed, crawled, snaked, or clung near the ocean floor. And that's just a single morning on a single day at this market. It's quite sobering indeed to think about all that life being pulled out of the ocean. So we've looked at Anthony, we've looked at the people and cultures that he worked alongside. Now let's get into the actual cooking. In that previous video, one of the passages I read discussed his working as a chef in the Rainbow Room at the top of the Rockefeller Center in New York City. Anthony gives an interesting look at the sheer scale of work he was doing at that time. But that was actually nothing compared to the volumes he was doing at a place called the Supper Club. The main dining room sat about 200, with private banquettes and booths along the walls, a dance floor, and a stage from which a 12-piece orchestra played 40s swing music. There was an upstairs mezzanine, a holdover from the club's previous incarnation as a Broadway theater, which sat another 150 or so, with a second bar, and off to the side, also on the second floor, was a smaller venue, a cabaret cum VIP lounge called the Blue Room, which sat another 80. And skipping ahead a page, the club, particularly during the winter party season when we regularly did banquets and sit-downs for hundreds and hundreds of people, required strength, skill, and endurance, and the cook's ability to improvise fast. The bulletin board on my office wall was clogged with party sheets. Sit-down meals for 300 would lead directly into 4 buffets and a cocktail reception for 700, often on the same day. The logistics involved in buying the food, preparing it, and moving it around for so many people were staggering. And then skipping ahead a little bit again. Buying $10,000 worth of meat a day gave me a strange and terrible thrill, like riding a roller coaster, and the simple act of moving ceiling-high piles of perishable fish and produce through my kitchen every day was a puzzle, a challenge I enjoyed. Obviously quite a monumental operation requiring a very intelligent and sharp and fast-thinking mind to run it all. And of course we get plenty more interesting behind-the-scenes look into the culinary industry. For instance, it's fascinating to learn just what an enormous percentage of the money made in the cooking industry is from alcohol sales. Anthony discusses this at one point when he's talking about a downturn in the economy in 2008 that hit a lot of restaurants pretty hard, and here's what he said about that. What a lot of people won't tell you is that, for many full-service, fine dining restaurants, the kind with elaborate service, freshly changed floral arrangements, chef's tables, and a private dining room, the prevailing business model before the crash was the reliance on the whale customer, the regular patronage of the kind of customer who would spend a few $100s on a meal and 10,000 or more on wine. The percentages on wine are generally excellent, and it requires relatively little in the way of labor or equipment. The margin on food, however, is razor thin in the best of times, even when the prices on the menu appear to be outrageously expensive. A few years back at Veritas, a bar customer was pointed out to me. He had blown through as much as $65,000 in 1 month, giving out tastes to fellow onophiles and strangers alike at the bar. And then one other quick note on the bar end of things here. Earlier, I rashly implied that all bartenders are thieves. This is not entirely accurate, though of all restaurant workers, it's the bartender who has the greatest and most varied opportunities for chicanery. The bartenders control the register. They can collude with waiters on dinner checks. They can sell drinks out of their own bottles. I've even heard of a bartender who brought in his own register, ringing a third of the drinks there and simply carrying the whole thing home at night. But the most common bartender hustle is simply the buyback, when he gives out free drinks every second or third round to an appreciative customer. If you're drinking single malt all night long and only paying for half of them, that's a significant saving. An extra $10 or $20 tip to the generous barkeep is still a bargain. All right, we're going to go from bar folks now to meat people and fish people. Meat class at the Culinary Institute of America was fun. Learning the fundamentals of butchering, I found for the first time that constant proximity to meat seems to inspire black humor in humans. My meat instructor would make hand puppets out of veal breasts, and his lamb demo/sexual puppet show was legendary. I have since found that almost everybody in the meat business is funny, just as almost everyone in the fish business is not. Well, take his word for it. And now from those glimpses into the industry, let's take a look at a couple of culinary notes. In a chapter called How to Cook Like the Pros, Anthony poses the question to potential home cooks. So, what do you absolutely need in your kitchen? You need, for God's sake, a decent chef's knife. No con foisted on the general public is so atrocious, so wrong-headed, or so widely believed as the one that tells you you need a full set of specialized cutlery in various sizes. Please believe me, here's all you will ever need in the knife department. One good chef's knife, as large as is comfortable for your hand. Just a little practical advice for the home chefs, and I found this bit of advice to be extremely on point as well here. There's no debating that it's better to cook at home whenever and as often as possible. It's cheaper for sure. It's almost always healthier than what you might otherwise be ordering as takeout or eating at a restaurant. And it is provably better for society. We know, for instance, that there is a direct inverse relationship between frequency of family meals and social problems. I'm interested in whether we should cook as a moral imperative, as something that every boy and girl should be taught to do in school, and woe to him or her who can't. I'm talking about pounding home a new value, a national attitude. But I do think the idea that basic cooking skills are a virtue, that the ability to feed yourself and a few others with proficiency should be taught to every young man and woman as a fundamental skill, should become as vital to growing up as learning to wipe one's own arse, cross the street by oneself, or be trusted with money. I actually really like that idea that all kids are taught in school actual useful practical life skills, and I would add to cooking other things like basic car repair and budgeting and those life skills that so many people reach adulthood with only the faintest idea about. And now, speaking of the healthiness of food, get ready to cringe on this one. I was well aware, I assumed, that your frozen pre-made burger patty, the one intended for institutional or low-end fast food use, your slender and cheap pre-packaged supermarket disc, was not of the best quality cuts. But when I read in the New York Times that, as standard practice, when making their American Chef's Selection Angus beef patties, the food giant Cargill's recipe for hamburger consisted of, among other things, quote, a mix of slaughterhouse trimmings and a mash-like product derived from scraps, end quote, and that, quote, the ingredients came from slaughterhouses in Nebraska, Texas, and Uruguay, and from a South Dakota company that processes fatty trimmings and treats them with ammonia to kill bacteria. Well, I was surprised. On that appetizing note, I'm going to take a quick break from the books, and using my newfound knowledge of cooking and chef skills, I am now going to prepare a special haute cuisine dish just for the pleasure of my viewers. So let's run and do that quickly. Okay, here we are, ready to cook up a delicious and fancy meal. So, the very first rule of creating haute cuisine is that you do not use a recipe. You need to make it up as you go. You need to feel the inspiration. You need to let the power of the cooking flow from within and through your fingers or something like that. Now, Tony did emphasize that the one important tool we need is the largest knife in the kitchen. So I pulled out a few of my biggest knives here, and ready? No, I'm not going to start off this show with some stitches. Show as if I'm doing a cooking thing. So I'm just going to grab my trusty kitchen knife here. And here's another top secret about cooking. The deliciousness of the final dish is going to be directly proportional to the amount of butter that is in it. So we want to not skimp on the butter. Get lots of butter in there. It's a very simple equation. More butter equals more delicious. All right. Now, I'm going to, that pan is hot. Remember, safety second. Deliciousness first, and then safety. So, there we go. We're just going to get the noodles in there and just brown the noodles. Just, there we go. Just give them a little shake, a little toss. Alright, just want to get them nice and brown. And, okay, that's brown enough. Let's just go ahead and get it off the heat. And there we go. Those noodles are ready for the pan. So, let's get our pan, get our nicely seared noodles, and apply those to there. Now, a little more butter won't hurt. Remember, more butter equals more delicious. And the salt is also another thing that goes in everything. So we need salt. You never put it in directly out of the shaker. That will affect the taste of the salt. We need to make sure we have some on our fingers. And then we pinch and swirl that salt on there, just like a true pro. Another key ingredient, second most important to butter, is cheese. We need cheese for more delicious as well, so let's just go ahead and grate some cheese onto there. There we go, looking good. We have a little bit of a smoke situation from here. All right, and because this is nouilles au jus, we need to add our jus. So we'll just kind of pour that into there. Good, perfect. So let's get the lid on there. Let's get that into our preheated oven. And let's get back to the book, and after a little bit of a cleanup here, I suppose. After a little bit of a cleanup, we'll just get right back to the book again. So. Oh, sorry about that loud squeaking, just my old bones creaking. The next thing I'm going to look briefly at here is Anthony's process of writing the book and the subsequent rocketing from rags to riches that occurred after it was published and received by the general public. On that note, it was interesting to read a book that was written when he was living in poverty, and then a book that was subsequently written when he was a multi-millionaire. So from this book now, when I sat down at my desk every morning to write Kitchen Confidential and began clacking away at the keyboard, I was both gloriously free of hope that it would ever be read outside of a small subculture of restaurant people in New York City, and boiling with the general ill will of the unsatisfied, the envious, and the marginal. Let it be funny for cooks and waiters, and F everybody else was pretty much my thinking at the time, which worked out okay in the end, as I never could have written the thing had I thought people would actually read it. So the result was an angry book in a lot of ways, and over time that's what people have come to expect from me, the angry, cynical, snarky guy who says mean things on Top Chef. And then in this 10th anniversary edition, I think it was, or maybe 5th anniversary edition, whatever special edition it is, it's been published with a bunch of handwritten notes throughout the book that were, I guess, added by Anthony years after the original publication was made, so that you can kind of pick up on things he might have wished he added or done differently the first time around. But anyways, with the benefit of hindsight, we get to read in this book the reason that Anthony believes it ended up being so incredibly successful. So I had believed when I wrote this book that I was writing it for a small group of restaurant insiders in the New York tri-state area. Everywhere I went, whether Melbourne, Portland, Singapore, or San Sebastian, I'd hear from cooks a similar refrain: "Dude, you wrote my life." And believe me, that feels good. It's funny to read the words of a still poor and destitute Anthony Bourdain talking about another famous wealthy chef he knew who sort of left it all behind for a long period of time to learn how to do pastry chef work, and talking about what he would do if he was wealthy and famous. I'd be endorsing blenders, committing unnatural acts in the pool near the Vegas outpost of my not very good anymore restaurant chain, and picking my liver in Louis XIII. At that point in my career, I wouldn't be shutting down the whole gravy train so I could learn pastry. I'd be mugging it up on the Food Network, schmoozing at the Beard Awards dinner, and contemplating a future where I'd never have to get out of my pajamas. Some slightly prophetic words about the Food Network being spoken there. Speaking of which, the now millionaire Anthony Bourdain talks about the Food Network and the fact that he went from making money by ragging on the Food Network in his first book there to becoming a celebrity chef on the Food Network. I was so supremely naive about so many things when I wrote Kitchen Confidential, my hatred for all things Food Network being just one of them. From my vantage point in a busy working kitchen, when I'd see Emerald and Bobby on the tube, they looked like creatures from another planet. Bizarrely, artificially cheerful creatures in a candy-colored galaxy in no way resembling my own. In my life, in my world, I took it as an article of faith that chefs were unlovable. That's why we were chefs. We were basically bad people. As chefs, we were proudly dysfunctional. We were misfits. We knew we were misfits. We sensed the empty parts of our souls, the missing parts of our personalities, and this was what had brought us to our profession, had made us what we were. I despised their very likability, as it was a denial of the quality I'd always seen as our best and most distinguishing, our otherness. Rachel Ray, predictably, symbolized everything I thought wrong, which is to say, incomprehensible to me, about the brave new world of celebrity chefs, as she wasn't even one of us. Back then, hearing that title applied to just anyone in an apron was particularly angering. It burned. It still does a little. What a pitiable fool I was. Of course, Anthony would go on to rise to that level, to achieve that superstardom that he loathed seeing on television. By my late 30s, I found that I was still lingering, and I admit, to a sense of disappointment, confusion, even defeat. What do I do now, I remember thinking. Detoxed from heroin and methadone, and having finally ended a lifelong love affair with cocaine, where was my reward for all this self-denial? Shouldn't I have been feeling good? If anything, all that relative sobriety pointed up a basic emptiness and dissatisfaction in my life, a hole I'd managed to fill with various chemicals for the better part of 25 years. At the age of 44, shortly after writing Kitchen Confidential, I found myself suddenly with a whole new life. One minute I was standing next to a deep fryer, pan-searing pepper steaks, and the next I was sitting on top of a dune watching the sun set over the Sahara. I was running roadblocks in Badamgang. Tiny feet were walking on my back in Siem Reap. I was eating at Al Buli. He also talked about just how rapidly this all happened. I'm writing these words in Bali, Indonesia, having just finished a long swing through Seoul, Jakarta, and the Java interior for my TV show. I'm sitting by the pool at the Ritz-Carlton, waiting on a novelty drink, something orange with curacao and a lot of rum in it. It will no doubt feature an umbrella. I get paid these days to eat and drink my way around the world, going pretty much wherever I want, and doing pretty much whatever I want, as long as I babbled about it to a camera while doing it. My hands, of which I was so proud at the end of this book, are now as soft and supple, presumably, as Rodario Dawson's ass. Last time I cooked regularly was about 6 months after the book came out, when things got crazy and I found myself gradually transitioning into my new day job. Needless to say, this celebrity chef racket has worked out okay for me. Writing and making television, no matter what some whining dumbass may tell you, is easy. Cooking is hard. So before I conclude this one, let me run down and finish up that dish that's in the oven. Alright, I think our dish should be done and ready to finish up here, so let's just pull that out of the oven. Has some loveliest odor of campfire, maybe tire fire, but definitely a lovely smokiness to it. Oh. Just wait till you see this get plated. Tell you what. You know what? Almost forgot. Add a little more butter there. There we go. the next thing I need to do here is just reduce the sauce. Okay, so let's just, there we go. Yep. Okay, now I have reduced the amount of sauce that's in there. And we need to get a little bit of vegetable in this. Color is key. The more color, the more delicious. Another one of the variables in that equation there. So, I've got my knife. It's important when you're cutting a vegetable to cut it with your fingernails facing the knife and then as fast as possible. All right? There we go. One moment. Okay. We'll put that in the dish here too. It's a little warm. Safety second, folks. And we'll get that in there. And now I think we're ready to plate this. So here is another important fact about haute cuisine is that the presentation is the key factor for flavor and verticality. Verticality is presentation. So let us, is that hot still? Okay. Wait till you see this. There we go. Okay. Remember verticality. So let's get that. This is true haute cuisine. The higher it is, the more legit we're talking here. Now, presentation. My wife has this potted plant in the kitchen here. So let's just pull the leaf off of that. There we go. Presentation. Oh, here we go. And one last pinch of salt, not from the shaker, from your fingers. All right. There we go. And now allow me to grab a spoon and present to you my dish. Oh, first some lactate pills. I put cheese in there. It's not going to be a good rest of the afternoon if I don't take my lactate pills. And here we go. Look at this thing of beauty. If that is not the most amazing looking thing you've seen, Yep, I think I have learned some true skills from reading Anthony Bourdain's books. Speaking of which, let's get back to finish up the books. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that, because now things are going to get a little bit sad. I don't think it would be right to talk about Anthony Bourdain's life without also talking about his death, especially since he himself in both his books talks about such things. For example, in Kitchen Confidential, he says, "I have no wish to die, nor do I have some unhealthy fondness for dysentery. If I know you're storing your squid at room temperature next to a cat box, I'll get my squid down the street, thank you very much. I will continue to do my seafood eating on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, because I know better, because I can wait. But if I had one chance at a full-blown dinner of blowfish gizzard, even if I had not been properly introduced to the chef, and I'm still in a strange Far Eastern city and my plane leaves tomorrow, I'm going for it. You only go around once." Despite that statement of his that he has no wish to die, there is a theme of severe depression to the point of suicidality throughout the course of Anthony's life, right from the younger years that he describes in Kitchen Confidential. Here's a time when he was feeling especially depressed while he was between jobs. "At night, I lay awake with heart palpitations, terrors, bouts of self-loathing so powerful that only the thought of diving through my 6th-floor window onto Riverside Drive gave me any comfort and allowed me to lull myself into a resigned sleep. He also describes a period after he had achieved fame and after he divorced his wife. He says, "I was holed up in the Caribbean about midway through a really bad time. My first marriage had just ended and I was, to say the least, at loose ends. By loose ends, I mean aimless and regularly suicidal." Skipping a couple of paragraphs. "That's where I was in my life, driving drunk and way too fast across a not very well lit Caribbean island every night. I would follow the road until it began to twist alongside the cliff's edges approaching the French side. Here I'd really step on the gas, and it was at precisely this point that I'd hand over control to my unknown DJ. For a second or two each night, for a distance of a few feet, I'd let my life hang in the balance because, depending entirely on what song came on the radio next, I'd decide to either jerk the wheel at the appropriate moment, continuing, however recklessly, to careen homeward, or simply straighten the effort out and shoot over the edge and into the sea. In this way, my life could easily have ended with a badly timed playing of Loggins and Mazzina. On one memorable occasion, as I waited in the brief millisecond of silence between songs, foot on the gas, the cliff edge coming up at me fast, I was saved by the Chambers Brothers. I recognized the tick-tock metronome of Time Has Come Today, and at the last second, turned away from empty air, laughing and crying at the wonderfulness and absurdity of it all, diverted from what I very much felt to be my just deserts, making, momentarily, some strange and profound sense, saving my life." He also talks about living life, knowing that it is such a brief period of time. "If there was any justice in this world, I would have been a dead man at least 2 times over. By this, I mean simply that many times in my life, the statistical probabilities of a fatal outcome have been overwhelming, thanks to my sins of excess and poor judgment, and my inability to say no to anything that sounded as if it might have been fun. I often use the hypothetical out-of-control ice cream truck. What would happen if you were walking across the street and were suddenly hit by a careening Mr. Softy truck? As you lie there in your last few moments of consciousness, what kind of final regrets flash through your mind? Something along the lines of, I should have had more fun in my life. I should have relaxed a little more, enjoyed myself a little more. That was never my problem. When they're yanking a fender out of my chest cavity, I will decidedly not be regretting missed opportunities for a good time. My regrets will be more along the lines of a sad list of people hurt, people let down, assets wasted, and advantages squandered. I'm still here, and I'm surprised by that every day." That's pretty sad to read. Along similar lines, he concludes Kitchen Confidential with these words about his life as a chef. "I'll be right here. Until they drag me off the line, I'm not going anywhere, I hope. It's been an adventure. We took some casualties over the years. Things got broken, things got lost, but I wouldn't have missed it for the world." And then he writes in the new edition, "No regrets." Similarly, in Medium Raw, he concludes again with these words, "Once again, we survived. We did it. We're still here." Well, sadly he's not still here, and while I can find some solace for him in the fact that he is no longer in any sort of emotional pain or fighting his demons, what I can't get my head around is the daughter he left behind. Here's what Anthony says about fatherhood. "It's all about the little girl, because I am acutely aware of both her littleness, how could I be otherwise, and the fact that she's a blank page." Skipping forward a bit, "I can only hope she's happy. Even weird and happy will suit me just fine. She will feel loved. She'll have food and shelter, a large Italian and Sardinian family, and a smaller American one." And before we leave this awful topic, there's this one final bit of really morbid foreshadowing given the nature of his death. And it comes during that same interview that's at the end of Medium Raw. "Offer me $20 million to do a game show, I'm not going to do it. I can't. I'm just physically incapable. Again, it's not integrity, it's not principle. It's just that, in order for me to stomach going out and doing the Guy Fieri thing, the cost to me would be I would hang myself in a shower stall." So to wrap up my look at these books as a whole, I will say that starting with the later book, Medium Raw, I didn't enjoy it quite as much. It almost felt like after all his success, some manager came up to him and said, "Look how successful your first book was. Another one would be like printing free money." And Anthony obliged by writing a bunch of semi-random chapters in which he rants about other rich industry people, which comes off as looking pretty bad now that he's a rich industry person. It wasn't quite so bad when he was writing, I guess, Kitchen Confidential as a poor working chef, but it doesn't look well in medium raw here. I mean, he even goes off on vegetarians in here, which, I mean, I'm not a vegetarian, but just to take a dig at them is kind of weird. So what did I take away from his original biography and inside look at the profession? I would say that at least part of his success was the fact that it came out, I think, during that peak time of celebrity chefs and cooking shows when it was all the rage on TV, and it gave people a glimpse into the behind the scenes. But of course, a big part of the success was the writer of the book, the personality that came through. And I think there's a sense that if I wanted to replicate something similar, I would need to write a book that everybody in my industry could relate to, and while doing so, be as scandalous as possible and name names. I'm not sure if I exactly have that in me, but at the end of the day, it was a very interesting look into a world in which I have zero experience. Something I always love to do is just learning about things that I know nothing about, coming from a highly intelligent and interesting individual. Somebody who, as with all of us, had plenty of flaws, but also had a lot of goodness in him, and a lot of true love and wishes for the well-being of people as a whole, despite how people had treated him in his own life. Rest in peace, Anthony Bourdain. Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really proud of the work that I put into making this video, and it would mean the world to me if you would take the time to share it with one or two people that you think might enjoy it as well. Cheers. Kitchen Confidential, Adventures in the Culinary Underbelly, and Medium Raw. Why is that lighting with blue? That I became somewhat morbidly curious. Psilocybin. I am that megalomania. I did end up with over. Anthony advises that if you want to be a place where you could easily picture a young Burt Lancaster just out of the joint, returning to find a young Dirk Duck. When we regularly did banquet. And there are fine knives and those are fine knives if heavy. Yeah, whatever. What was I angry about that I'm still angry about today? Oh well, whatever. Hey Louie, whatever. One final brief bit here before we leave this morbid topic. Surprisingly, that's not horrible. In fact, it's probably one of the better things I've cooked in a while. Oh my god, I'm such a bad cook.